In this video, I'll discuss the ways you can contribute to BugGuide, other than, of course, by adding your own images. I'll talk about commenting on images with suggested identifications or corrections, and I'll talk about contributing to the forums, which are found in the main menu. To start, I'll talk about commenting. How do you know when your comment will be useful? What should you say in your comment? Let's start with an example. Here's an image the contributor identified as an octoid. Now, I know this is an octoid, but I don't know what an octoid it is. I don't recognize it at all. Maybe you recognize it. If you recognize it, you can add a comment. Let's say you think you know what species it is. Comment with the name, and then maybe you can say why you think it's that species. Or if you don't have any particular reason, you just think it looks right. You're about done, but you should probably caveat your identification so that the contributor of the image understands that you're not an expert in the group, this is just your opinion. And you want to do this so that the image contributor, especially if it's a contributor who doesn't often submit images of, in this case, moths, knows that you're not one of the experts in moths on BugGuide, because it's not always obvious who is experienced and who is not experienced. And it's certainly not always obvious who is experienced with, for instance, noctuids and who isn't. So let's say you have some knowledge of noctuids, but you're certainly not an expert. You want to caveat your identification. For instance, you could say, I'm not an expert, but this looks right to me. Then you can post your comment. I'm not going to post it because this is a useless comment. But it wouldn't be useless if you actually had a real suggestion. Then you'll post the comment, and the contributor will get an email notification of the comment, which is why I'm not posting it, because otherwise Mark would get a useless email notification from me. But the contributor will get a notification, and will maybe agree with your suggestion, or maybe not, or maybe think it's at least close and it's a good lead. But you'll want to caveat your suggestion so that the image contributor doesn't think this is an authoritative suggestion and doesn't move the image without first considering whether he thinks the move is correct. If he thinks it's correct and he feels confident given his knowledge of the group, he may move it to species, or maybe he'll move it to genus if he thinks the genus looks good but he's not sure about species. Or maybe he just won't move it at all. And if someone comments on your image suggesting an identification, and the commenter is not an expert and not a contributing editor, then it's up to you to make the decision whether you think your knowledge is sufficient to justify a move. If it's not, you can take the suggestion and table it and wait for something more authoritative. Now let's say you find an image of moth in ID request, or in Lepidoptera, and it has no suggested identification. Well, this one has a suggested identification, but let's imagine it didn't. Let's imagine the image contributor just labeled it moth, instead of moth tiger. Since it's moth tiger, that would suggest the contributor at least knows it's a tiger moth. And actually, I forgot, I've seen this one before. This actually has a suggested identification. So if you know it's Appenthesis, but you don't know which species, a comment, of course, isn't helpful. And really, if the contributor has already suggested a species, unless you have an alternate suggestion you think is better, this isn't really a place for a non-expert to contribute. But let's say this contributor has no idea what it is. Now, as an editor, I would tag the image and move it to where I think it belongs. But if you're not an editor, of course, you can't do that. You can tag only your own images. You can't tag anyone else's images. But what you can do is comment. You always want to comment on the first image submitted. This is the second image. You want to comment on the first image. The reason for this is that people tend to click on the first image. And so if you comment on the second image, the image contributor will see it. The contributor will get an email notification about your comment, but other people likely won't see it. So comment on the first image, and let's imagine this didn't have a suggested ID. You can comment that you think it's an appenthesis. And you could comment by simply adding a question mark, indicating you don't know what it is. And you don't have to leave anything in the comment body. Except you will have to leave some character. It doesn't accept an empty comment body, but when I don't have any comment, I just add an asterisk. You can add whatever you like. It can be a period, it can be a dash. That's about it for suggesting comments. Basic guidelines are only suggest if you think you have a decent idea of what it is, and it's a suggestion, it's a level of specificity that the contributor of the image hasn't indicated in the post. You want to check the title, of course, and you also want to check the remarks section. Because in this case, the title is just generic moth, but the contributor actually does have an idea what it is. Now let's say you find an image you think is incorrectly identified. Here's an example of an image that I incorrectly identified a few years ago. Now, there are two things you can do, really, if you think an identification is incorrect. The most obvious is to comment. Maybe you can say, not sure. This looks like acroterminal to me. And you can post that. As I suggested before, you want to caveat your comment if you're not sure. So here you indicated you're not sure, and you're saying, this looks like it to me. So you let the image contributor know to take what you've said as a suggestion, not as an authoritative identification. Now, there's another option. This is an option you can take as a first option, and also you can resort to this if you comment on the image and no one responds, or the contributor responds and says, I'm not sure either. What do you do then? Well, the simple way to do that, and really this is generally good practice, unless you're familiar with the contributor and know that the contributor will follow up. If you're not sure, you want to make sure you don't forget about it. And here we can go to the forums. And if you think you found a misidentification, go to possible misidentifications and create a new forum topic. And make sure to link to the image you think was misidentified. Copy the URL, link to it here. And then you might want to add a little bit more detail, but this would really be sufficient. Might want to add at least the genus though. And then you can post it. And the idea here is that you've left a record of what you've found, and an editor can come along and deal with the issue. And that's actually what happened in this case. Someone found this misidentification, and then I followed the image, the link to the image. I took a look at it and decided it looked wrong, and then I moved it. There are other sections of the forums you can, of course, contribute to. If you think you found an issue with the guide page, Let's say you looked at a guide page and maybe you noticed there's a typo, maybe you think the taxonomy is wrong, maybe you think the identification information is out of date, or it's just plain inaccurate. If you think there's any issue with the guide page, create a forum topic and explain the issue. As most people have done here, you should probably title it with the name of the guide page. Now this one's kind of exciting. Let's say you had an image and you think you know what it is, and there's no guide page for it. You may have contributed the first image of a species. As with the other forum sections, create a new forum topic, maybe title it with the name of the species, provide a link to your image, and maybe add a little explanation as to why you think your identification is correct. And wait for an editor to address it. If you have something else you think you can contribute, it might belong in general discussion. There are, of course, a number of other sections as well, but I'm not really going to address these in this video. I would encourage you to explore the forums more. When in doubt about how to contribute, it's always a fine idea to email an editor. Let's say you think you've learned a fair amount about moths and you think you can contribute in some way. You've suggested a few identifications, they've generally turned out to be correct. You've suggested some misidentifications. Again, you've generally turned out to be correct. And maybe you think there are other ways you can contribute, you're not sure what else to do. Presumably, if you've already contributed to moth identification on BugGuide, you're familiar with who identifies moths. In this case, you'd know that I move a lot of the images. So you might find my user page and email me. And if you want to be more active, and you're familiar with the site, you understand how it works, and you have some knowledge about identification, you can request to be a contributing editor.